the Member of Parliament for Islip, Northern and Pinner, and I chair the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Migration. Welcome to this evening's event, which is about the Windrush Lessons Learned report and the follow-on. We have a galaxy of stars from amongst the experts in the world of migration. And I'm very conscious, chairing tonight's session, that given the announcement today in Westminster, and we have the Minister very kindly joining us this evening, there may be questions about more recent developments, but we're very keen to ensure, given the landmark significance of Windrush and the report that followed it, that we do maintain our focus on that debate. So the panellists this evening, we have firstly speaking Wendy Williams, who is the author of the independent Lessons Learned review following Windrush. We're going to hear from Kevin Foster, who is the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Immigration at the Home Office, and his colleague Matthew Rycroft, who is the Permanent Secretary at the Home Office. We're going to hear from Paul Butler, the Lord Bishop of Durham, who is a principal, like me, of the RAMP project, and he's taken a leading role speaking up for the Church of England on refugee issues and society. And we're going to hear from Catherine West, who is the Labour MP for Hornsea and Wood Green, and is the Shadow Foreign Minister for Europe and the Americas. There is going to be plenty of time for questions after speakers have made their initial contributions. And I would ask, if you want to raise a question, ideally use the Zoom chat function on the screen or raise your hand, and the hosts are going to be just making sure they pick up those messages, ensure those questions are fed through, and we may need to group some together to make sure we answer them as efficiently as possible. This evening's session, as you can probably see from your screen, is being recorded for the RAMP project. And I think it's important, as we get into that say we keep our focus on the lessons learned from Windrush and what this means. For the All-Party Parliamentary Group, this is something which has been a very significant issue on our radar. We recognise that the events that gave rise to Wendy Williams's report were events that in many ways were a long time brewing, and we know that cross-party decisions have been made that have affected the way that we treat people who came to this country as refugees, as migrants, as asylum seekers, with all sorts of different statuses, many of which changed their legal position over the years. And the rise of the hostile environment in the early 2000s, as steadily people who were seeking asylum were stripped of access to benefits, through to decisions that were made under different governments in the Home Office, through to the need today to make sure that as we understand and get to grips with the detail of what the new policy will look like, that we make sure that we are treating people in a humane and compassionate way, but also robustly upholding our laws. So learning the lessons from things that have happened is clearly absolutely critical. So to start the discussion this evening, I'd like to invite Wendy Williams to speak about her report and the recommendations that she made. Wendy.
Thank you, Chair. Over the next 10 minutes, I'll set out three things: what I was asked to do and the context. Secondly, my findings and recommendations. And thirdly, the next steps. So firstly, the task. In the summer of 2018, the then Home Secretary appointed me to carry out a review of the events leading up to what became known as the Windrush scandal. I was asked to answer 6 questions, which boiled down to what were the policy, operational, and legislative factors that led to members of the Windrush generation being caught up in enforcement measures designed for people who are in the country illegally. What other factors played a part? Why wasn't it spotted sooner? And what were my recommendations for hopefully avoiding something similar happening again? So to the context. The Windrush generation came to the UK from the Caribbean between 1948 and 1973, answering an invitation from the UK government to help rebuild post-war Britain. They came, they settled, and made a significant contribution to society. They regarded themselves as British And indeed, the legislation made that clear. But the problem was that they lacked the documentation to prove it, and official records weren't kept. Many people did register their status, but many people didn't. And the reason for that was that they were assured by the Home Office that a failure to register their status would not affect their rights in any way. And my report sets out the relevant documents that confirmed that to be the case. But as successive governments set out to prove that they were being tough on immigration, they introduced a set of enforcement policies, the most notable of which was the hostile environment policy, which was designed to cut off access to things like healthcare, jobs and housing, with the intention that those who weren't entitled to be in the UK and access those services would leave. The problem was that the Windrush generation were entitled to these rights, but they lacked the documents to prove it. And so those who were unable to prove their status to the high standard that had been imposed latterly lost their jobs, lost their homes, lost access to public services, and their very sense of British identity. And in extreme circumstances, some of them were locked up, removed, and returned to their country of birth, in some instances, a country that they hadn't seen for over 50 years. Now, there are a number of both internal and external warning signs, and many organisations set out the risk that the policy might trap the wrong people. So that was people who had the right status, but who didn't have the documents to prove it. Yet despite those warnings, the Home Office pursued the policy out of an unquestioning conviction that the policy was the right thing to do and that it would be effective. So on to my findings. As David has said, I found that the scandal was a long time in the making. I also found that it was both foreseeable and avoidable, and that there were various institutional, cultural, and also political factors which included a failure to keep on top of the complex immigration legislative landscape which had developed significantly over decades. And there was therefore no awareness of the impact of different acts and different rules on different groups. One of my other findings was that the Home Office demonstrated a culture of carelessness and also disbelief, because the people making applications were met with a response that the likelihood was that they had no entitlement to be here, despite the fact that we subsequently found out that that was the case. That was not the case. But I also talked about a culture of ignorance and thoughtlessness on the subject of race and also the history of the Windrush generation. And I said that some of these factors were consistent with some of the elements of the Macpherson definition of institutional racism, although I didn't reach a definitive finding. But I did make 30 recommendations designed to show three things: that the department had acknowledged the wrong that had been done, that it was opening itself up to wider external scrutiny, and finally, that it must change its culture to recognise that migration and indeed wider Home Office policy, whatever its objective, is about people, and as David has said, should be rooted in humanity. Now, my recommendations fell into 3 different themes. I am aware that the Home Office has since put my recommendations into different themes, but that's absolutely fine. But the 3 themes that I've identified, the first is the department and the society it serves. So it's outward facing. And these recommendations relate to understanding the history of migration to and from the UK, engaging with the public, particularly the Windrush Group and other interested parties, and seeking to understand the impact of the policy on the Windrush Group and providing redress to those who've been affected. I also made recommendations under this theme that relate to working with the public to develop effective immigration policies, and linked to this, fully integrating the public sector equality duty so that it can be viewed as a positive tool and an enabler to help avoid similar situations arising in future. And finally, under this theme, I made recommendations that were geared towards looking beyond the Caribbean and to the wider Commonwealth to identify whether others had been similarly affected. So that's the first theme. The second theme relates to the department and its workforce. So it's inward facing. And those recommendations are aimed at addressing the cultural factors, such as the lack of an institutional memory, improving operational practice and decision-making so as to provide a better service to the public, but also of the department being more reflective of the society that it serves. And that's at all levels, not just at junior levels. And that brings me to the third theme. And that group of recommendations relate to the department's role in wider government. And those recommendations are aimed at equipping officials to provide the best possible advice to ministers by having effective data systems, effective training and development arrangements, and also providing better quality submissions. I've also made recommendations that are aimed at addressing the issue of race so that the department can really lead the way in demonstrating a clear understanding of the issues and a coherent plan for tackling race effectively in terms of wider service delivery, especially given the department's remit. And so finally, to next steps. My report was laid before Parliament, I think it's a year ago to the day. The Home Secretary in July of last year announced that she was accepting all 30 of my recommendations, and in September of last year, the Home Office published its comprehensive improvement plan. The Home Secretary's invited me back a year after the plan's publication, so that's in September or October of this year, to review progress made against my recommendations. So, Chair, hopefully that set out in summary the review, what I found, and also the next steps.
Wendy, thank you very much indeed. It's fantastic to hear from the author of such a landmark report directly about what she found. And picking up the point you made about things being a long time in the making, the last time I gave evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee on Migration Issues, I was sat next to Andy Burnham, now the Mayor of Greater Manchester, who made the point during his evidence that the system he was now criticising as the Mayor of Greater Manchester was a system that he implemented when he had been the Minister for Immigration in 2005, the role that today is held by our next speaker. So I'd like to invite Kevin Foster, MP, to share his thoughts alongside his colleague, Matthew Rycroft. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, David. It's a genuine pleasure to follow Wendy and make a few remarks. And it's wonderful to be here, albeit in a virtual capacity this evening. And I wanted to start by reflecting on, hundreds of thousands of individuals from the Caribbean and across the wider Commonwealth have made an immeasurable contribution to the UK society, literally helping to rebuild our country after the devastation of the Second World War and building their lives, their homes and their families here in Britain. And shamefully, many of those families then went on to suffer hardship and injustice at the hands of successive governments over several decades. And Wendy's report set out in powerful and moving terms these injustices and the injustices which happened as a result of Home Office policies. It certainly made for profoundly difficult reading for everyone associated with the Home Office, and the story she used on the cover of her report was one that particularly stuck with me, of someone who'd gone for a family event and then could never return home. Hence this, the Home Secretary has apologised unreservedly for this painful episode in our history, and in response to the Winrush Lessons Learned review, she published a comprehensive improvement plan setting out our plan to deliver the lasting and meaningful change the Windrush generation deserve, and to make sure the Home Office better represents all the communities it is serving. I will hand over to the Permanent Secretary to talk about our response to Wendy's report and the wider cultural change underway in the department. But before I do, I wanted to talk about two key aspects of our work to right the wrongs inflicted on the Windrush generation. First, the Windrush Compensation Scheme, which was launched in April 2019 to compensate members of the Windrush generation and their families for the losses and impacts they suffered. And in response to feedback from affected individuals and community leaders, we made some significant changes to the scheme in December, which means more people are receiving significantly more money more quickly. And the changes have had an immediate impact. Within 6 weeks from those changes, we had offered more in compensation than we had in the first 19 months of the scheme. And since the end of December, we've more than doubled the amount paid to individuals. And in total, to the end of last month, into February, we had offered almost £18 million in compensation, of which over 6.1 million has been paid. I recently spoke with Caribbean High Commissioners in the UK, and I was pleased to hear they felt the changes we have made demonstrate we are responding well to the feedback from affected communities and parliamentarians. This is good progress, but we now must focus on ensuring all those eligible for compensation come forward to receive it. Engagement and outreach have been a core part of our response to the Windrush issue, even in the rather constrained methods we have to use during the pandemic. And I spoke at the Caribbean Forum last week and reiterated our wish to continue to work with High Commissioners and others to ensure we are reaching all those who could have been affected, as well as using the events to rebuild trust with communities. In last December, the Home Secretary launched a £500,000 Windrush Community Fund for grassroots organisations and community groups to raise awareness of the compensation scheme. We received a large number of applications, 77 in total, and are working with Voice for Change and the Windrush Working Group on the shortlist. We will announce the successful organisations shortly. And just to confirm, the Windrush Community Fund will open for a second phase of funding on the 1st of April and close on the 30th of June. So we will continue to work to support those who were so badly let down by the Windrush scandal, and we are working at pace to transform the culture within the department which allowed it to happen. This work is a priority for myself, the Home Secretary, and Matthew, who I will now hand over to, so he can provide some more detail on the work of the department in response to the Windrush Lessons Learned review, including the key work to change the culture of the Home Office to ensure that something like this cannot happen again.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you, Chair. I'm Matthew Rycroft, the Permanent Secretary at the Home Office. I'm absolutely delighted to join you today, albeit virtually. And for me, the Windrush report is personal because it came in to our lives just as I was becoming the Permanent Secretary. And it was such a powerful moment to read the report that Wendy has just described for you, and to see how close she was to saying that this department was institutionally racist. She didn't quite say that, but she got pretty close to it. So what bigger wake-up call could you have as a department than that? We had a very, very strong burning platform, a requirement to change and to respond. And one of the things that I've been most pleased to see coming in as the new permanent secretary of the department was how people in the department embraced it. I would have expected a fair degree of defensiveness, I think it's fair to say, but I'm really glad to report that I think the whole department has understood not just the 30 specific recommendations, but the spirit or the energy underlying those, which we really need to respond to in order to address the lessons that Wendy was identifying and that we must address, as the Minister was saying, in order to ensure that this sort of scandal can never happen again. So it's a year ago that the report came out, a year ago that lockdown started, and a year ago that I started. And in that year, we have, I think, made a really decent start at responding to that cultural wake-up call, that transformation that is needed. In fact, we used a specific anniversary, which was last Friday rather than today, to formally launch our new transformation program, which has got various different things in it, which I'd be keen to tell you about. So first of all, we've got a new set of values. This was a bottom-up exercise across the department to come up with the following values: to be respectful, compassionate, collaborative, and courageous. I think between them, those do sum up some of the really big things that Wendy was getting at. We've got a new vision for the department, which is to help build a UK that is not just safe, but that is also fair and prosperous. And I think, again, that fairness aspect goes to the heart of the Windrush report. Culturally, I'm determined that we act on Wendy's call for us to be more open in terms of the communities that we serve, more open in terms of each other. So really listening to people on the front line, really ensuring that they have a voice, however junior they are and however much they feel as though they might not, is really important that we empower them and give them that voice so that they could challenge things like this if they ever saw them happening again, and ensure that they prevent this sort of thing from happening again. We are doing a structural change as well to seek to break down the silos and to really focus on the three big missions that the department does, which broadly speaking is homeland security, so protecting our country from terrorism and other threats like that. Public safety, which is all our work to reduce crime with policing and so on. And then thirdly, migration and the border. And then other issues in the department are going to be in cross-cutting, horizontal capabilities of families of jobs, including on caseworking, where you can really seek to build a whole career for someone in, for instance, that caseworking function, going from one part of the department to another, but building up expertise and becoming really excellent at customer service. But there's all sorts of other ways in which we have begun to respond to Wendy's recommendations. We are, just to pick a few examples, I'm very happy to add to more later, we are seeking to improve the robustness and the inclusivity of our policy making, including working with the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And we've got a whole work plan with them to make sure that we are taking our public sector equality duty seriously. And actually, the announcements that the Home Secretary made today about the future way that we'll be dealing with asylum and irregular migration has absolutely gone through that process in terms of the policy making. And as she announced today, we're embarking on a period of consultation now. We are seeking in the case-working parts of the department to take a more compassionate approach. We've got this new face behind the case training, which we're rolling out across UK visa and immigration system, so that everyone who is involved in caseworking really thinks about the individual, the person, the face behind the case, rather than just the process or the numbers, or still less having targets or anything else like that. And then as a department, we are seeking to build up the inclusivity of our department. We've obviously, like the rest of the civil service, really focusing on race as an issue. It was not just for Windrush reasons, but also, you know, Black Lives Matter and all those other big race issues come up in the year since I've been here. And in my capacity as civil service race champion, seeking to progress that. And there's a lot of good activity going on in the Home Office in that regard. So I'm actually, you know, quietly confident that in the first year we have done a fair amount to respond to Wendy's concerns and each of the recommendations. There's some progress made against all 30, some of them are complete, some of them are just sort of beginning. But when she comes back in September, as she said, she will see a really significant progress against her recommendations, including, as the Minister just said, on the Windrush compensation scheme, which I think has really gone through an acceleration recently after a reset. And I just wanted to use that as an example of what I hope is now a genuinely listening department. I mean, even though we had originally designed the compensation scheme with members of the Windrush community on the inside of that, we still realized after some months of its operation that we could do a bit more to make it faster, simpler, and crucially more generous. And so we did, so we changed it. And I think it's that sort of approach that we're going to need to adapt in order to make sure, as I said at the beginning, that we're not just ticking the box on each of the 30 recommendations, but that we're doing something bigger than that as well. And that's really getting to the spirit that Wendy identified. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Kevin and Matthew. That was really, really helpful and a great sense of how the Home Office has got a boot behind making sure these things are implemented in a way that will really feel different to the human beings who are at the other end of the system. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Paul Butler, the Bishop of Durham. He, as I mentioned in the introduction, has done a huge amount in looking at refugee issues in society. And he's going to speak about it very much from that perspective, and also how we work together to ensure that as the wrongs are corrected, exactly as Matthew has described, that we see the genuine cultural change that we all recognise is necessary. Bishop Paul.
Thank you, David. I feel privileged to be able to speak today on this subject. Given the helpful detail other panel members have shared, I want to focus primarily on the cultural change required, not only in the department, but also in other institutions, including the ones that I am part of, that will lead to the systemic and lasting change needed. I want to start by thanking the members of the Windrush community, those who first arrived to contribute to our society in rebuilding the post-war economy, to those children and grandchildren who followed. The strength behind the call for change and the injustice now recognised is in full due to the dignity of those who have shared their stories. The loss incurred is difficult to comprehend, and the trust that was immeasurably broken is an injustice of deep magnitude. I share their incredulity and disbelief at what has occurred after they've given so much to their country, and when being British was so integral to their identity. As Wendy Williams' recommendations so clearly highlight, it's their voice that is key. I therefore wanted to pick up on recommendation 9 in particular. The role of a migrants commissioner would, I think, ensure that going forward there was someone responsible for engaging with migrant communities who could assist government in identifying any systemic concerns and could work preemptively to address them. When a community feel that they have not been listened to, it is important to seek to remedy this. An advocate at the heart of policy decision making could go some way in doing this and ensuring past mistakes are not repeated. I think at the heart is the right term. It needs to be someone who has the authority, independence and resources to be a powerful voice for migrants within and beyond the Home Office. I welcome recent indications that the government is looking at ensuring those prevented from returning to the UK through no fault of their own will not need to fulfil residency requirement to apply for citizenship. But it was the words on behalf of Trevor MacDonald from his lawyer that stood out to me. It matters that his voice, when only seeking that which he was entitled, was not heard. The government repeatedly refused to give credence to what he said or experienced. This leaves an indelible mark on this group of mainly black migrants who consider UK home. Changes on the statute book to remedy this continuing injustice are important, but arguably more important is that the voices of those impacted are given a platform and are genuinely listened to. It's on this point that I would like to see more progress made on reconciliation events with the Windrush generation. It is the deep work of working with communities directly and indirectly affected by the policy that is crucial to ensure it delivers on what it sets out to do. One of the key recommendations related to this is the call for a full evaluation of the hostile environment. As a society and a government, we have to ask ourselves how moral it is to actively make life for a vulnerable group of citizens more difficult, putting the burden of proof on them to prove their legal status, taking away their right to work, taking their right to rent a home, and sometimes taking their liberty until they do so. The rationale for this policy has been based on an assumption that more draconian measures will act as a deterrent to others who may seek to make the UK home. But do we actually know that it is a deterrent? Government needs to honestly assess whether measures are actually proportionate and effective in meeting their intended objective. The evidence from the Windrush scandal seems to me undeniable. There is an inherent risk from a hostile climate to those migrant communities who do have legal status to live and remain in the UK. Is this policy worth the cost to lives? So there is a question here really in one sense for Kevin as Minister to encourage him to bring the review of the hostile environment before Parliament at the earliest opportunity, and we will look forward to it with interest. I'd also like to hear more, and perhaps this can be picked up in the Q&A, on the need for robust impact assessments which consider whether there's a risk of an adverse impact from certain policy proposals on different racial groups. It's the role of Parliament to hold the executive to account on the impact of policy. We would be well served by detail on the impact on different racial groups, and would indeed expect this as part of the Sovereign Borders Bill. Let me close though by speaking about the institution I am also a part of and the reason why I'm a member of the House of Lords. I cannot come and point fingers at the Home Office without recognising the part the Church has played in perpetuating institutional racism. The racism experienced by the Windrush generation in parish churches in the years they first arrived, and sadly the years to follow, is a stain on the soul of the Church I serve. My colleague, Father Andrew Morton Mumby, Rector of St Peter's Walworth, spoke eloquently of racism as one of the three great pandemics of our time, alongside COVID-19 and the climate emergency. He did so at General Synod last year, where we unanimously backed a motion to lament and apologise for the unconscious and conscious racism encountered by countless Black, Asian and minority ethnic Anglicans arriving in Britain from 1948 when seeking to find a new home in the Church of England as part of their new home in the UK. But we do not do justice now if our lament does not lead to radical and decisive action. Otherwise, as the Archbishop of Canterbury stressed, we will still be having these conversations in 20 years' time. The Church remains a place which is poorer for the lack of participation of all God's people in ordained leadership and lay roles, and I would argue this is the same for the Home Office, our other institutions of state, our communities and our society as a whole. Diversity in leadership is key to bringing forth lasting cultural change. And I think the report was right to stress this. And it was good to hear previous comments about how it's beginning to be addressed within the Home Office. Wendy Williams recommended that the Home Secretary should clarify her department's purpose, mission and values, which should have at its heart fairness, humanity, openness, diversity and inclusion. And I think it's this kind of thinking, some of which has already been set out, that will lead to a culture change in how we treat migrant communities. Migration policy and wider Home Office discussions on asylum and economic movement are about people. And to quote the report, whatever its objective, this should be rooted in humanity. Apologies are important, but making genuine amends requires the government and others of us to commit to working differently, working from a place of empathy and renewed understanding.
Thank you, Bishop Paul. Again, very thought-provoking and helpful in a number of the questions which have been raised by people. You highlighted there in your remarks. In particular, you talked a bit about leadership and the need for leadership to be representative. And he talked about the detail of following through how we measure the meaningful impact. Our final speaker from the panel is our next one, Catherine West, who is the Member of Parliament for Hornsey and Wood Green and a former council leader in London and a former caseworker for David Lammy MP. So a huge amount of experience in all sorts of things that are impacted by migration policy. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. And it was really lovely to follow the Bishop Butler, who has spoken about the importance of the role of faith, because I think actually right now during COVID, I feel that our faith communities have been very much at the forefront of our communities. And indeed, some of the Windrush events are going to be held in church halls and on church properties and be a real centre for bringing people together. We also have CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, coming up in June, and I would hope that the Home Office might expedite some of the cases which are outstanding so that at CHOGM it can be a sense of celebration rather than a sense of still having outstanding concerns. We know that reconciliation really can only happen once justice has happened, and there are still too many cases which are outstanding for a sense of reconciliation to be achieved yet. The task force was set up more than 2.5 years ago, and we know that months have passed since the government promised the time for action. My statistics might be a tad out of old, and I hope they are, but when I last looked, only 18% of people who'd applied for compensation had received it. And I'd be very happy if Matthew would put in the chat if it's more than 18% now. But I'm afraid, as with the David Lammy review into the criminal justice system, we too often have reviews and are too slow to act to right the wrongs from those reviews. The Black Lives Matter movement highlighted the need not just to recognise the discrimination and racism that Black people continue to face, but to follow through. In recent months, it's emerged that at least 9 people have died waiting for compensation from the Windrush scandal. And famously, Paulette Wilson, who worked in the hospitality department at the House of Commons, whose story was written up so beautifully by Emilio Gentleman in the Guardian newspaper. She wrote about the 2 periods of detention and immigration detention which Paulette experienced when she was about to be deported to Jamaica. Paulette passed away last year, and I feel that her treatment by the government was disgraceful. So I do hope that as a result of that and the drama about the on the BBC, which has been very effective in communicating the human side of this scandal, I'm hoping that the Minister will tell us tonight that he may apply targets to this process so that we can give victims binding guarantees about how long claims could take, because we really can't have this still going on when we go into the Commonwealth Heads of Government in June. Just to give people a flavour who are on the call, and I can see Stephen Timms is on the call, but there'll be other MPs as well. With the 3 constituents whose cases are still outstanding, you know, I've had meetings with Kevin and also one with even the Home Secretary when I went into her office just before she went into the House of Commons, and also written on a number of occasions and liaised with community lawyers and all sorts of people. It really feels just too slow. And for those of us who have done a lot of casework in our time, and I know, Chair, you will have because you've been a council leader as well, that in the end, you get a lot of casework, and I feel that normally it shouldn't have to be running into the Home Office Secretary's office and meeting with the Minister and still not having things resolved. If a person doesn't qualify for the scheme, then it's better to know rather than just to be left hanging. And obviously we also have the knock-on effects of lack of access to benefits, and a number of constituents have written that job seekers and housing benefit claims are just suspended while this is sorted out. We know that the lawyer Jacqueline McKenzie from McKenzie, Butte and Pope explained that many people are unwilling or reluctant to apply through the scheme because it's so stressful and it does make people feel extremely anxious. And obviously just that long wait can be difficult with some individuals. So in conclusion, Chair, the select committee as well, which obviously does represent both sides of the House, has been very clear that there are three things that are needed: a sense of a timetable, so that when people put in for a scheme, that they genuinely know what the goalposts are, as it were, in terms of the decision making. The second one is regular updates, because obviously people are not receiving the effective communication between the Home Office and either their legal representatives or themselves. And thirdly, the recognition of the impact that those protracted delays are having. And I think that's where we get back to Bishop Butler's concept of reconciliation, that when we have eventually sorted this, and I do hope the Home Office will get on with it, that then I think there is a point of reconciliation for the Windrush generation and their families. Because until really we get to the bottom of the scheme and the problems with the scheme, we can't have the reconciliation. And one other point, Chair, just in case you don't get to me in the chat, there's another sort of ticking time bomb, and that is the EU scheme for European Union. And this is tonight's about the Windrush, but I just wanted to say that as somebody who's been involved in immigration casework for over 20 years now, I do feel that if we can avoid making this into a similar problem in another 20 years' time, future MPs will be very grateful that their caseworkers don't have to write endless letters to the Home Office. I think there's a specific request about extending a deadline, and I think if we can try and be preventative rather than post facto, I think we'll probably have a better result. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. We're getting lots of really good questions coming in on the chat. Now, all of our speakers have given a really valuable perspective. Some of the questions coming in are quite technical. Some of them are more strategic political questions. The first person I'm going to ask to put in a question is Stephen Timms, MP. Stephen, I think I can see you on the screen. And you'll be followed by Baroness Lister.
Thank you, David, very much. And thank you for a very helpful and useful event, and to all the speakers. I was particularly struck by Wendy's point about how, when she looked at what has happened about Windrush, just how determined the Home Office was to resist accepting that it had done wrong, even when it became very clear that it had. And I think there's the same sort of resistance for some other groups where I think things have gone wrong as well. I just wondered why Wendy thinks that the Home Office was so resistant to recognising that something had gone so badly wrong. What was the root of that?
Right. I don't know whether Kevin or Matthew might perhaps be best placed to respond to that. Kevin, do you want to say a brief word and perhaps hand over to Matthew if that works okay?
To be honest, I'd be happy. To be honest, it was directed at Wendy. Happy to hear Wendy's thoughts on this one.
Wendy?
Yes, I'm happy to respond. But in answer to Stephen's question, I don't know. But it was a consistent theme, irrespective of who it was that I interviewed, whether it was ministers, whether it was officials, whether it was more junior officials, more senior. The consistent theme that came through was that this was a case of, I think I put in the report, bureaucratic bad luck. You know, it was unfortunate what had happened. It was an absolute tragedy, but it was unforeseeable and unavoidable. And that was why one of my specific findings was that the scandal was both foreseeable and avoidable. And that's why in the report I go through, there's a flow chart that shows the different timelines, what activities took place when, which served to refute the widely held view that this was just an unavoidable tragedy. And that's why I referred to the cultural aspects as far as the department was concerned, and that lack of an ability to look beyond what was immediately facing people and try to look to what were some of the wider issues that all coalesced and all led to that outcome, which could have been avoided. But the recommendations are in place, and we've heard from Matthew and also from the Minister the determination that they have to do something about it. And I saw that one of the questions in the sidebar was, how will you know when culture change has occurred? And I think there's a combination of tangible and intangible indicators, and I'm certainly very much looking forward to going back into the department to see the extent to which I am able to sense that and see that there has been a cultural shift.
Thank you very much indeed, Wendy. I had a sign in the wall in my old local authority that said, no matter how good the strategy, it is always worth checking what is actually happening. And I think that's something which probably is really relevant to what you've described. I'll offer your chance if Kevin and Matthew want to respond in respect to the Home Office in a moment. I've got Baroness Lister next, and then Baroness Hamway. So Baroness Lister.
Thank you. And this builds on what Bishop Paul was saying. I mean, I absolutely agree that the importance of culture, and I think it came out so well in Wendy's report, and thank you all for what you've said in the panel. But I would like to know whether the review of the hostile stroke compliant, whatever you want to call it, environment will be able to look at the legislative architecture which underpins that, because actually that is not just about culture, it's about that structural edifice. I'm thinking in particular of the right to rent, because a lot of the stakeholders who I'm sure have been saying this to the department think that that has to go. And I'd be interested to know what Wendy thinks, whether Wendy thinks it's possible to change the culture without looking at the legislation as well.
Wendy, once again, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. In respect of Baroness Lister's question, I think it's a holistic approach that has to be adopted. That's the reason why my recommendations included a recommendation that the hostile environment policy was reviewed. One of the aspects that came out in the review was that there was this unquestioning belief that the policy was effective. When I asked for indicators and metrics that would demonstrate that that was the case, such as the number of voluntary returns, I'm afraid there was a paucity of information that served to support that unerring conviction. And in fact, when it came to the number of voluntary returns, that data showed that the number of voluntary returns had actually gone down over the period of the policy. So that was why I recommended that the policy was fully evaluated to see whether it was achieving the objective. And if it isn't, then the department will, of course, wish to take that into account.
Thank you. So could I ask, thank you for that. Could I ask Kevin whether the review is looking at the legislation itself and not just questions about how it's being administered?
I think I'd be clear that as a Home Office, we don't intend to move away from the principle that only those who are entitled to public services should be accessing them. And that's something that we will retain and maintain. But certainly we're going to look at how it's working, how that effectively operates, and also ensuring that it doesn't have the unintended consequences that were seen in the Windrush generation, how the actual checks operated, particularly looking back at some of the cases around where people have been in employment for a very long period of time with the same employer. I won't use the name, but I can think of one of the early compensation cases where someone literally worked for the same employer for nearly 40 to 50 years, about how things operate, particularly when people have been in employment for a long period of time. For example, we've made clear we won't expect retrospective checks to be made on EEA nationals who are in employment, who almost certainly came in the time of free movement. So that's where the review will look at and focus, but we are going to maintain the idea that, as I think people would expect, that you shouldn't be accessing work, employment or other things as services here in the UK if you're not entitled to do so.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. Baroness Hamwee.
Thank you. And thank you all for your presentations. I attended a Home Office briefing not that long ago about the work being done on the scheme, and we discussed the cultural changes quite a lot. And there was a very good moment when somebody mentioned reverse mentoring, and several of us said, what? And the head of the compensation scheme said, oh, yes, I'm doing reverse mentoring with a junior colleague. I was very impressed by what I heard then, and therefore all the more surprised, I think. I went onto the Home Office website this morning actually to look for the asylum policy paper, and saw that the latest figures on Windrush compensation had been put up. And they seemed not to give the information I would have expected to see. Cumulative amount paid, but no range, no indication of the interim payments, and which were final settlements, the number of people who've been referred for assistance and what that was there, but not what the outcome was. And in particular, not the number of claims which were at different stages. So I was left with the question not just about the substance of that, but about how much consultation there had been with stakeholders about what should be put into the public domain. And if I can throw in another one, I'd be really interested to know what the thinking is about equivalent problems, if you like, that may arise when the EU settled status grace period ends in June.
There's a range of questions there. Just looking at the panel, as they touched on a number of issues, I see Matthew Rycroft was super quick to get his hand in the air. So Matthew, perhaps you'd like to start responding.
Can I respond to a couple of those questions? And I'm sure the Minister will want to say more about the EU settlement scheme, which is one of his specialist subjects, if I may say so. But the other part of Baroness Hannah's question about engagement with stakeholders and making sure that we put out the right information. I mean, very, very keen to do that. And obviously we are doing an awful lot of that already and putting a lot of information out. But if there are ways that we can improve that, if there are aspects of the communication which we're not getting right, then, you know, we're very happy always to look at that, and we'll take that one away. If I may, on some of the earlier questions. So there was a question from Ernest Lister about the compliant environment, and that part of Wendy's recommendations. I can just give an update that we are undertaking a full evaluation of the policy and the measures that added up to the compliant environment individually and cumulatively. We've begun that work and we're aiming to complete it, the bit on the right to rent this summer, and we will hope to have finished the initial analysis of data and evidence on the whole of compliant environment in the autumn of this year. So we'll keep people updated on that. And then finally, on Stephen Tims's question, I mean, it's almost a definition to me of how well as an organisation adapted, as to the extent that it can really deal with failure and learn from it rather than seek to suppress it. And so I think, you know, one of the things to be really focusing on is the extent to which the Home Office can, you know, genuinely become a learning organisation, so that when things do go wrong, that we all of us together sort of learn from them and improve as a result, rather than seeking to suppress them, which obviously is a sort of natural instinct, but not one that is going to get the best in terms of continual improvement.
Yeah, perhaps say a couple of little things. Matthew thinks very well covered the subjects he picked up on, but I'll just briefly say about what's the thinking that's then gone in after the end of the grace period in terms of the EUSS. I think the first part is the fact that there is an EUSS, learning from the lessons of the past, that someone today might find it relatively easy to prove that they were in the United Kingdom, resident here on the 31st of December 2020, but in 20, 30, 40, even 50 years time, they may find that next very difficult, or their children might find it very difficult to prove that they were permanently resident here, and in terms of automatic citizenship, if they're born to someone who is settled here in the United Kingdom. So it's very much the thought was there about the scheme in itself. And I'd give the contrast to the fact that British nationals overseas back in the 1990s, when the handover for Hong Kong, we have that register today. We issue passports against it every single day, so that record's been kept fairly secure, and we have a record who is covered by it from the mid-1990s, whereas just automatically granting us a status might have worked for the next couple of years, but as we got further and further away, and people's ability to evidence that applied to them would have got more and more difficult. But also in looking at what we have around the provision, we'll shortly publish the guidance around what will be the grounds for a late application to the EUSS. They are, I think it's safe to say, reasonably generous. They've already confirmed some, for example, someone aged under 18 at the end of the grace period, not just those in care of a local authority, those who do not have mental capacity to make their own application, and a number of other criteria. And this is perhaps where the lesson learned from Windrush is, we will make clear to caseworkers that these will be non-exhaustive lists, and they should look at what is the right outcome in the case that is presented to them as well, even if it's not one of the examples on the list of late application guidance. So again, looking at the learning process from that era, and similarly, we're making clear to employers that we're not expecting people to do on the 1st of July retrospective checks, which again is where for some of the Windrush generation, people have been in employment for a very long period of time, had not have to evidence their right to work because at the time it didn't exist, or was a very different set of legal frameworks around immigration at the time they started employment. That's where I think, so I would say some of the lessons that we've taken, particularly looking at the EUSS, is around late applications on reasonable grounds. And I've touched on, there's actually no time limit. In the Bill Committee, I gave an example of a child who's 5 today could find that their parent or the local authority didn't apply for them when they turn 18 in 13 years' time. We would see that as a reasonable ground for a late application.
Thank you very much for the responses to that. And there are a couple of questions that have come in from people who are members of the Windrush generation, and they cover a number of issues, some relating to the scope of the compensation scheme and some relating to the scope of what's been announced today. So if I may, there's some, Gertrude, if you'd be willing to unmute and ask your question. Gertrude, I can see you've appeared on my screen.
Hello, hi.
Would you like to ask your question, Gertrude?
Yes, my question relates to Windrush victims in Nigeria mainly. I have friends and relatives who were caught out by the Windrush scandal, and for the last 3 years I've been trying to help them. They are genuine eligible applicants. They lived here, they were settled here. 5 of them have had their applications refused. Others are too elderly or too frail to actually make the applications. And I've heard from lots of other people in Nigeria whose elderly have not made the applications, or if they have, they've been refused. So there seems to be some kind of culture of disbelief that is still continuing despite everything that the Home Office has said. Why are people who were settled here lawfully being refused under the Windrush scheme?
Okay. Right. Wendy, perhaps, I mean, certainly in the chat as well, Gertrude added the detail about the Home Office apparently refusing to review 160,000 non-Caribbean historical cases. Do you have a view about that, Wendy?
As it's a casework matter, I'm afraid I'm going to have to defer to the department, safe to say that, as I indicated in my opening remarks, one of the recommendations relates to the department looking beyond the Caribbean to see whether others have been similarly affected. And so I would just repeat that point.
Thank you very much indeed. I don't know whether Matthew or Kevin will be in a position to comment on that question.
I must say, again, in terms of specific casework issues, it's probably better if we provided a response in writing rather than off the top of our heads. What I would say, though, is actually, we are clear the Windrush schemes go beyond just the Caribbean. I must say, actually, last week when I was engaging with representatives of Caribbean governments, there was a question of why we hadn't just focused it on the Caribbean, why we'd had the criteria going more widely, and we were clear that there were people affected from across the former Commonwealth, which does not just include Caribbean states.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. So I can see there's Ewan, I think it is. Ewan's asked a number of questions. I see Ewan, are you able to unmute and put your question?
Hi, good evening, yes. I'd like to ask, my grandfather came to the UK in 1955 from Nevis. He is exactly the same case as Gloria, case study 1 in the Windrush Lessons Learned Review. I know he has a right to a vote in the United Kingdom. The Home Office knows that. And I've been waiting since the scandal broke for him to just have the nationality status letter to indicate that this is the case. You know, he came here in 1955, he had children born here. He had a house in Leeds, so all the documentation is there. But I'm not getting anything from the Home Office. The second part of my question is, the Home Secretary put out her statement today, but I see nothing in there for people like my grandfather who came from the British colonies, but had to live here for 5 years to acquire the right of abode in the United Kingdom. However, an alien could have lived here for 12 months, naturalized, and got their status under Section 21A of the 71 Immigration Act and pass those rights on to their children and grandchildren. However, my grandfather could not do that because he does not meet the wording of born, registered, or naturalized in the UK. So he was put at a disparity, and the disparity means that aliens were given more rights than British, natural-born British citizens from the colonies. I want to know if that's going to be resolved so I can have my status resolved as well, as I was born a citizen of the UK and colonies, but I did not have the right of abode in the UK because I was born over there and did not come here until an adult.
Okay, thanks, Ewan. That's a good question because we know that the UK and the story of disengagement of the UK from empire has involved all sorts of different statuses and legal status being given to different places around the world. And it's an important principle. I wouldn't expect a speaker to comment on casework. I mean, Wendy, may I just ask first, do you have a view about that? And is this one of those issues which perhaps the Migrants Commissioner, which you envisage, might pick up as part of their work? And then perhaps if I may give Home Office colleagues a chance to respond perhaps to the question of principle. Wendy.
Thank you. I do not profess to be an immigration and nationality specialist, and made that clear during the period of the review. So again, I'm afraid I would have to refer to the department. But as to your question about the Migrants Commissioner, this would be one of the sorts of situations where I would envisage that the Commissioner would be able to engage effectively with the department in order to seek to advance some of the issues, some of the legislative issues to which Ewan has referred.
Thank you. Again, we'll just invite Minister or Matthew Rycroft, whether you would like to comment on it.
Just about my grandfather's status as he's been waiting. Same exact case as Gloria.
Right, okay, thank you very much. It's a high profile example. I don't know, Minister or Matthew, whether you'd like to say anything about that.
I think first, again, as you touched on, Chair, I don't think it's appropriate to get into individual casework. If the examples fed through the APPG will happily reply in writing, or via the individual's Member of Parliament will happily reply in writing to it. I think we do recognise that, you know, nationality law, and particularly disengagement for empire, there were a number of statuses granted, as many holders still today. Obviously, British national overseas, the most famous one in terms of Hong Kong and the handover in '97, but there's British protected person, there's British overseas citizen that relates back to Malaysian independence. So there are a number there, and we certainly recognise the certainly recommendation 21 about consolidating some of the legislation in this area, because there is a number of statutes that apply. And we've announced today some changes to the British Nationality Act, and it's no great secret that we're looking at in the future about routes to settlement and some of the criteria that are in the Act about how we can ensure we actually want to simplify the process for applying where appropriate to be a British citizen, but also what the position would be around some of the various different statuses that sit. I mean, we do recognise the recommendation 21 around consolidating some of this to make it more clearer for everyone involved, including Home Office decision makers.
Thank you, Minister. I've got Grace with her hand up. Grace, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. Are you hearing me there?
We can hear you fine, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm a bit concerned about the issue of Windrush returnees who have now been settled in the UK, but we cannot apply for our children who were born outside of the UK, even at the time when ordinarily they would have been born in the UK. My case, I was stripped of my ILR in 1985 when I tried to come back to the UK, and my son was born in 1988. And so if I had not had my ILR taken away in 1985, I would want to believe that he would have been born in the UK. I have made inquiries as to how my now settled status under the Windrush scheme can assist my son to come into the UK and be joined with the rest of his family who are in the UK. So that's my question. How do I go about this? Because I'm hearing all sorts of things about returnees not being able to have their family members join them. So if somebody could clarify this for me and tell me the way forward, I'd be most grateful.
So Grace, I think what we'll do, if we may, is we'll through the APPG get some more details about your situation, and we'll take that up with the Home Office, because I think that's going to be the most effective way of making sure we try and get an opportunity to answer it. I'm going to just wrap up a couple of questions which have been picked up. Now that the Lord Bishop Paul talked about leadership and representation in the context of the church. I know, Matthew Rycroft, you mentioned leading on diversity in the context of government. Would be interesting just to get some reflections, perhaps Wendy, maybe starting with you, perhaps from Matthew, given that specific role, about how progress is going to be seen and what you see will be the benefits of that in due course. So, so Matthew's unmuted, so do you want to go first, and then Wendy, I'll come to you next if that's okay.
Either way, Chair. Wendy, did you want to go first?
Matthew, you're first.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's a really, really important question, and thank you for it. First of all, the good news is that the Home Office's workforce in total is 23% Black, Asian and minority ethnic. So that's we are overachieving, if you like, compared to the UK national average of workforce, which is 14%. But as soon as you start looking one level of detail down into the grades, you see that that number drops off very dramatically as you get more senior within the Home Office. So that by the time you get into the senior civil service, we're only between 7 and 8% Black, Asian or minority ethnic. So it's a really significant drop off from a very strong starting point. So it shows that we've got some serious work to do to ensure that people in the most visible leadership positions in the department really are representative of the society that we serve. So we have not got to that right place yet. What we have done is put in place a whole series of measures over the last year, building on work that had happened previously, to accelerate opportunities for people. So for instance, and each of these sounds quite small, but when you add them together, you could create a movement. So making sure that there are people who are Black, Asian, or minority ethnic on recruitment panels, making sure that there is not just reverse mentoring, as one of the previous speakers rightly highlighted as a very positive step, but also going from mentorship into sponsorship, which is a more active type of mentoring that can really help people from underrepresented groups, including Black, Asian, and minority ethnic colleagues, to get opportunities. And then one final example is that when you look at the performance management system in the Home Office, you see that again there are disparities by race, and so we have decided to change our system of performance management for the upcoming financial year, so the one starting in a couple of weeks' time. So there's some small examples. There are others as well. This will take sustained effort in order to ensure that the senior reaches of the Home Office, and indeed more broadly the civil service, are representative of our country.
Thank you very much. And Wendy.
Thank you. I think Matthew's really identified the nature of the issue, which is, yes, when one looks at the headline figure, it reads very well, but when one delves not very far under into the detail, the reality is somewhat different. I deliberately was not prescriptive in terms of what activity I would expect the department to undertake, because it is for the department to determine what activity it needs to take in order to achieve the objective. What I was clear about, however, were the outcomes. And the outcomes that I would be looking for are a change in culture, but also a change in the makeup, in the very appearance of the department. And that's why amongst the recommendations that I've made, I have asked the department to publish progress that it's making on the subject of workforce representation. I'm also really pleased that the department is also looking into the performance management processes that it has in place, because recruitment, retention and progression are all equally as important if the department is to have a genuinely reflective workforce at all levels.
Thank you very much indeed, Wendy. Now, time is somewhat against us. There are a number of really good questions which people have raised, and I'm just going to try and capture and put, particularly to Matthew and to Kevin, those. A lot of them essentially are about understanding the detail and making sure that people are fairly treated. So I think Catherine Thane has raised the point about adverse HMRC records being held against people. There have been issues raised about Wendy's report identifying a lack of understanding and ignorance about the policy implications amongst people in the Home Office. And certainly we know, for example, the way in which policies that are owned by the Department of Work and Pensions or MHCLG can impact on migrants, which may be running somewhat in a way that's detached from the Home Office's intentions, or just have become outdated. So perhaps just sort of summarise it and ask maybe through Kevin and through Matthew, as we enter this consultation, to give that commitment to engage and make sure that that we can bring all these issues together exactly in the way that I know, Kevin, you've indicated many times to me in the House that you're very keen that we do.
Yeah, I'm certainly keen. We certainly hope people see that the consultation we've put out today around the new immigration plan is different to the type of consultation we've seen in the past. You know, we tried to get it so it's accessible, people can involve, and also individuals can get involved and be part of it. So linked together, and particularly talk about DWP and MHC. One of the things I've been very keen since I came in to the job as Immigration Minister is regularly meeting with the Department for the Work and Pensions. You know, ultimately we both have a big impact on the labour market overall, and we should be considering our work together. And for example, some work we're doing currently on those who are EEA nationals who the DWP have recorded as claiming certain welfare benefits, actually proactively going out to encourage them to apply to the EUSS if they haven't, if we don't think they have, but rather than leaving it until after the deadline to advise them of that. Again, starting to use some of those types of ways we can change our approach and work together across government and be more conscious of doing so.
Thank you. Colleagues, I'm just mindful of the time. I'm very much aware that people have other commitments this evening. So I really need to draw proceedings to a close at this point. I would like to place on the record, firstly, a commitment on behalf of the APPG that we're capturing the questions and the issues that people have been raised. So even if you haven't had a direct answer from a panelist to your question, we will make sure that that is collated, and we'll take that up with the relevant person. And I'd like to say a very big thank you, particularly on the day of a significant government announcement, to have not just the Minister responsible, but also a shadow minister with an interest able to join the panel and contribute. And Wendy Williams, given her I'm sure, extremely significant workload in this field, it's been fantastic to have you join us alongside a senior official from the Home Office and the Lord Bishop as well. And finally, thanks to the RAMP project and colleagues at the APPG and everybody who's joined this evening. At one stage, we had around 145 participants from across the sector. And I know that this would have been an enormously valuable use of time for everybody. So thank you very much, and may I wish you a very good evening.